I'll be pulling you in right after that. So the guild starts now. Hey, Patrick, welcome to the guild.
Howdy, I wish I could have seen that. I didn't get to see the cool dragon thing. I'll have to look at it again later.
Absolutely. There'll be a recording of the event. That's a good point. So anyone that missed it or if you miss anything, this will be recorded and you'll have a recording of it after the event as well. So Patrick, anything you want to talk about before you actually jump into your presentation, before we get into it?
I mean, I miss having conferences. I did 19. We did more than it was all of us. We did 19 last year. So it was like a big year for conferences, and we were really getting into the swing of things, and we got comfortable and started really liking doing them. And then
Wow.
obviously this year changed things. So we do miss seeing everyone. It was always fun so it's always like a bunch of the same people as well. You
Yep.
end up running, they're almost like their colleagues. It's like the people in marketing or SEs or whatever from other testing companies as well, all meeting, like, I'll meet you in Columbus, I'll meet you in San Francisco, I'll meet you in Prague.
That's good. You probably pick up a lot of things that are happening too in the industry, I guess. Like in the hallway, what people are working on, what's hot.
Yeah,
People
I
are,
mean, the
yeah.
good, the bad, like what's
Yeah.
going to go,
Yeah.
who got let go. The rumor mill is always exciting.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, Patrick usually does have good gossip. If you ever see him, he usually knows what's going on with these other companies. So it's good to get talk to him when you do see him on
Yeah,
site.
it's a smaller world than people realize. Like
Yeah,
testing is a large thing, but when it comes to like, there aren't as many people doing testing as you would anticipate. Like when you actually talk about the platforms today and the ones, if you're looking really for the ones that are doing well and the ones that are innovating in the space, it's just a handful of us. So it's always fun to see each other.
absolutely, absolutely. Cool. All right, Patrick. So, like I said, I believe you're going to be talking about API testing, how to shift to right with monitoring. And as I said, I think this is a really hot topic that's going to help a lot of folks. And you have real world experience. You're a big vendor. You talk to a lot of companies, so I'm sure you've actually seen this in the wild and how it works with some good tips for everyone. So that'd be cool.
Yeah, exactly. So you want me to share my screen?
That'd be awesome. Yes.
Great. Yeah. So the big thing I really want to push is that, like, I think the testers, especially now when you see all these budgets being cut, testers can actually be doing a lot more with their roles.
Hmm.
And I think it's important for them to realize it and push for that with their management. So if I do this, let me know if that worked. Can you see my screen?
I cannot. Oh, there it goes. I see it now. Perfect.
You're seeing Shift API testing, right?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Perfect. See, this is just so much easier in person because I just turn the monitor around and everyone can see it. Like this nonsense. Yeah, so really what's interesting is, like, there's all sorts of buzziness around what you would call it. We're still, like, here we're saying Shift API testing right, because everyone talks about shifting left, which, by the way, people have multiple different ways to describe what shifting left means. To me, it means using mocking and writing a test before the APIs are even built. But anyway, ultimately what we mean here is like testing in production. And that's sort of like where I want to really hone in on things. So the thing, I mean, just to set the stage, specifically with APIs, there's two large things to note. The first is 83% of all web traffic is API traffic. So what we've been seeing in the industry for a while now is, like, there's 100 different platforms focused on UI and mobile app testing, but it's shifting more and more because those UIs, like the WebKits that they're using, is getting more solidified into one. So you don't need to do as much of the cross-browser stuff as you used to have to, because now, like, browsers update themselves very easily. Like, I remember back in the day, you had to make sure, like, it worked for every single browser and every single version possible. But that's becoming a little less problematic. So when you look at the actual traffic these days and, like, with the proliferation of APIs, like, that's really where the stuff is. Yet there's a surprising lack of platforms out there for API testing. I mean, that's why we built this thing, because we tried to find something and we couldn't find anything that worked for how we wanted it to work. But the second part that I think it's sort of important to bring to your organization and to talk about is all the security issues and all these vulnerabilities you see. 95% of them are just human error. Like, if we actually on our blog have 3 different stories that are very specific to API issues that released billions, like the India one was billions of people's private identities were released, and it was simply just human error. Like, people want to talk about hacking and all these things. At the end of the day, like, screw ups are how things happen. Like, most accidents are caused by people just not thinking of something. And that's especially true today, because now with, like, the API API gateways like the MuleSofts and the Apogees, you can build these APIs faster than ever, but they don't have testing. So what you're seeing is like we're building more and more APIs with less and less testing and expertise around it. So it's just leading to more and more of these issues where like Twitter, the country of India, and like the United States Postal Service can have these catastrophic issues that were just totally like human error. So what has happened that has sort of like left this issue? So what's happening today is like with the India and all those things, India, United States Postal Service, this is happening with every company. The major thing that's happening here is, so you have this automated suite of API tests that you've built, and it's running in like pre-production. Then you're using your CI/CD to push it live, and those same tests are running automatically as part of your CI pipeline. And that's great. Now you're in production, you're live. Well, at this point, the only thing happening is companies are using a monitoring platform. Like you lose, like what you built and what you spent all this time on and creating these really smart functional end-to-end tests is thrown away and only reused on the next deployments. And you have a completely different thing and a different team working in production. So like this leads to like a huge issue, and a lot of our customers, like this is the thing that's really helping us sell deals, honestly. It's because we're able to like use the same tests as monitors, and they're coming to us with this problem. And so the problem we're seeing is just, the analogy I like to make with monitoring is, you know, imagine you have a child, you want them to be educated. And so how do you measure their success of being like educated in their school? How good is the school? You either like, are you counting it by attendance? Because that's what uptime is right now for a lot of companies and how their monitoring goes. It's purely just attendance based. Status code 200, yes or no, we're good to go. That's not how it works today. Like the way you actually make sure your child's being educated is by standardized testing. So actually asking them a bunch of questions in a lot of different ways and analyzing every single bit of it. So that's what I think of in terms of like what everyone should be doing and needs to be doing, is actually writing these standardized tests, which is your automated tests, but using them against production, against live environments. So again, like production testing, to me, that's monitoring. Just you have your tests, just run them every 5 minutes against your live environment. That's monitoring. It's really not super complicated, but weirdly it happens so rarely. And that's the reason why I always like to talk about this with people, because I think it's a huge need that, especially for me, like rings true to my heart with, I'm in the testing industry. Our testing experts could be running the monitoring of these APIs. So like statistically, what we've seen of like, what's a good monitor? So for us, a good monitor is it analyzes the entire API. So an API is a lot of data. Think of it as a book. So you want to proofread that book. So go through every single object, every single bit of data associated with the object. You want to make sure that there's consistency and reliability in the response entirely through the entire thing. Even just a comma or a semicolon out of place can break it. And the big thing, and this is something that happens so rarely, and even with good testing companies, we see it often, is they're using for testing CSVs or just like a static database of data. So using this static data is what leads to a lot of these issues. Because if you're using the same 50 queries as part of your production, as part of your staging testing, then it pushes it live. Those probably don't even exist on the production database. So like you're not actually really testing the API. You're sort of just saying, well, it seems fine for this small handful of tests that I've already run before. So what is a good test comes into this, because what we always suggest for people, so imagine you're like an e-commerce store. You want to do search, add to cart, and checkout. That flow should be one test, which should also be one monitor. It shouldn't be one monitor for search, one monitor for add to cart, and one monitor for checkout. The whole flow should be one monitor, because you want to see how the APIs interact with each other. Like that's the entire goal of it. It's the entire goal of APIs. It's the interaction with each other and being able to put all these pieces together for one consumer flow that works. So just as a quick example of what we mean by creating sort of an end-to-end test. So this is sort of a common test we do with some of our companies. Like at the very top, there's a get. It's variabilized, so you can reuse it against any environment. But what it's doing is it's hitting this endpoint that has a list of all the company's products. Then it validates that response. And then you see right there in the for each, it says, hey, for every single product that we have, let's make another get call and actually go into that one specific product and then validate that product detail page as well. And the thing that's cool about being able to validate these product detail pages is that you're able to go beyond just a normal test of this has to be this has to be this. You can start adding business logic, which doesn't happen with UI testing or mobile app testing. Business logic could be anything along the lines of, if it's a pair of shoes, the size should be 2 to 12, but if it's a pair of pants, the size should be 28 to 36, for example. The size object exists the same, but you can actually create these if statements and be reflexive and catch things that may lead to, we see it all the time where like Amazon has something for $1 and everyone tries to buy it real quick. That is something that could be caught with an API monitor in production. So from the statistics of what we've seen, a good API, it passes all of your automated tests that you're using and staging as part of your CI, run those in production as well. But also the uptime should be 99.8. And that's one of the most interesting aspects of this whole thing, the 99.8, because what we're seeing is a lot of companies are coming to us bragging about their uptimes. Then when they bring us in to be sort of a validator, a third-party validator, because some of them have a partner API with contracts and SLAs, they realize very quickly that their SLAs aren't what they thought they were, because they were just checking for pinging. They were just pinging it, checking the status code, maybe a couple objects, and that was it. They weren't actually doing that sort of detailed end-to-end test that I just showed you. And that's where you actually you catch these uncaught errors. And the uncaught ones are obviously the most dangerous ones, because those are the ones that can last forever. Everyone knows when an API is down. It's clear as day. Like a basic monitor can catch that. But what happens when it's working not quite right and it's costing you money? That's what the goal of this is, to use your most detailed tests as your monitor. So the big question is, how is it happening? So in our experience from all these large companies we've dealt with, and we've sort of found one consistent thing, especially with large organizations. The question is, who owns uptime monitoring? So there's a testing team and there's a monitoring team, and they so rarely merge. And while for maybe UI and mobile app, to a certain level, that's acceptable, when it comes to APIs, that's just not an acceptable option. So what we're seeing is, when you look at the market of the most popular monitoring tools, so it's a monitoring team using monitoring tools, and these are the most popular ones. All four of these suffer from the same issues that don't allow you to actually validate the metric that we like to use, which is functional uptime, which is a much more detailed uptime measure. So here's just a list of some of them, and we'll make this available to download later on if you want to have this conversation internally. That's the goal for us, like improve this stuff. The first is, look out for that keyword of synthetic testing. That's what they all talk about. Oh, we have API synthetic testing. That's just another word for the bare minimum. The absolute bare minimum. It's a status code check, maybe check a couple objects, but that's it. The next one is who's actually creating these monitors. It's very rarely someone with expertise with the API, like the actual people that build and write these functional tests are never the same person that is setting up the monitors. So you're ending up with these people that don't totally understand what the API should do, thus going back to the minimal amount of testing they're doing. The next one is just the redundancy of work. It's a totally different platform. Then the last one is just how smart these tests actually are. Like, these tests don't go through the entire consumer flow of search, add to cart, checkout, because of the shortcomings of the monitor, because the monitors weren't built for this. These monitors were built to do one specific thing when it really comes to like install these little machines on each of our servers so we know what the performance is of all of these calls and stuff. But what we're talking about here is more of testing the end result. And so every company tries to expand, build new features, build new products so they can increase how much they could sell to each customer. So they're adding this synthetic testing, but they're not actually achieving a goal. They're just trying to get some more money out of you, but they're not there at all. So in a nutshell, that's the issue. Monitoring team is not the same as the QA team. And we think for APIs specifically, like that team that's smart and knows how to create automated tests for their APIs should be working with the monitoring team and working together to create these functional API monitors. In whatever method or whatever platform you use, that should be a combination. So ultimately, like, let the experts monitor APIs. So I just have a quick list here of all the reasons why. I mean, you could just read them yourselves. But again, like domain knowledge, API breaches are caused by human error. So minimize that human error by having experts actually write these tests. You'll catch production bugs that aren't usually caught, and you're just going to accelerate you're going to accelerate just your time to market. And so that was it, actually, for me. Nice. Yeah, but just ultimately, like, that's the thing. Like, You have testing experts. Why aren't they helping your monitoring team actually do functional uptime monitoring of your APIs? That's what it all boils down to. And I apologize for the cough. I had a bad breakfast or something. It's attacking me.
No problem. So Patrick, what have you seen companies do then to solve that, to get the teams together to actually do the monitoring that needs to be in place?
Well, I mean, what we see is people come to us and they start using us, but there's other ways to do it. Ultimately, like if you've created your own automated testing stack, just putting those on a schedule. Like if you have a CI/CD, maybe you could schedule it to run against production, a minimal amount of tests against a production environment every 5 minutes. Ultimately, it comes down to, if you're automating your tests, just make them automate against production every 5-10 minutes. It's really sort of that minimal. Some platforms help you do it, like ours. Others, if you're just building it from scratch, just a couple software test engineers can set that up for you. Ultimately, it just comes down to like setting up a scheduler for that suite of tests that you've already built.
Now, a lot of times when people are doing anything in production, they're afraid they're going to mess up production. So any tips of when you are doing APIs? A lot of times you need to do a transaction. So what do you normally do to get over that?
Yeah, well, I made the mistake once. I set up tests back when I worked at UsableNet, I set up tests and I bought 22 TVs overnight by accident because I set up an automated test to make sure that the Shop NBC website was working right. So I've definitely experienced those issues. There's a couple of different ways I've seen it done. I mean, the cheap way is just don't test, create user, which isn't great. The better way I've seen is if you create a smart test that goes through multiple steps, that last step can be delete that new user you've created. And another way I've seen, and this is back in my old e-commerce days, is if you use a credit card number 4 with 15 ones, a lot of companies have set it up so that that'll process, but it won't actually process in the back end. It just processes on the front end. So any one of those can allow you to sort of just go through it and fake it without actually creating a bunch of fake users or fake data.
Very cool. So Patrick, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned something about security. So would a tool like monitoring an API, how would it have found any of these security issues? What did you mean by security issues that like India and US had?
Yeah, well, that's the fun buzzword we hear every day. Like all these companies are raising all this money, creating all these platforms that say security, which is great, but they're actually not doing that much. Like if you actually know a lot about APIs and you really analyze how they're doing security, they're basically just throttling a lot of the inbound API traffic and comparing it to the contract, which is, if you did that as a test, it wouldn't be approved. So what it really comes down to is 95% of issues are human error. Human error are just things that fail a test. So why aren't you just testing it more thoroughly, making sure you don't release those issues? For example, the one that came out of United States Postal Service error, they made the mistake of allowing you to search by wildcard and it gave you every single result. Well, you should be creating tests that actually test for hey, what happens if I test by weird things, including the wildcard? What's the result? That's something that should have been caught with just a basic functional test that clearly wasn't. The issue with India, one of their multiple issues was that they had an API that was public that shouldn't have been public. Not really sure how you test that. I mean, you could set up a test for it, but that's just basic human error. Then the other one was throttling, had unlimited throttling. So you can keep guessing people's personal identity, like their version of social security numbers. You could keep guessing nonstop. And if you hit it, it gives you information. That's you should be able to do some load testing to make sure you have some throttling on any sort of API you make public like that. Just those sorts of things can add a big difference. And one thing I didn't mention in the deck is you want to make sure that you are doing performance monitoring or load testing, especially. So load testing in production is really useful because number one, you don't have to do that much of it to really get some interesting data just to see how it performs now versus last time. So you don't have to kill your systems at all. And the second part is you can catch things like memory leaks, which are hard to catch. And you want to catch those as soon as possible. That more than once, our load tests have caught people's memory leaks that they had no idea about until we were running this load test against production, even if it was at 6 a.m. on a Monday.
That's a great point. I think a lot of people overlook performance for some reason. An API seems to be a perfect protocol to use for performance because unlike using a UI or something, they tend to be more reliable in my experience. So the same thing you've seen?
Too.
Yeah.
A lot quicker. Like when you're doing that UI, it actually has to render all of that HTML, download it, and then render it. So the actual speed of your computer, whatever, might have an effect on that stuff. With an API, it's pure data, so it can happen real fast. So you can get 10,000 quick hits. And the thing that's interesting to note is that, again, you should be using your end-to-end test, that multi-step test, as your load test. Because what we found is one part of the chain might break and it might be in the middle before like the first part breaks. So if you're just hitting search 1,000 times, it'll work every time, so you might have it cached. But then the add to cart thing, you can't cache it. That might break if there's more than like 50 at a time happening. So you want to be able to load test that entire path in production as well as staging. But the thing is, like when you're doing a load test and staging, it's a good way to catch a memory leak real quick, but that's not really what your actual like API consumers are going to experience. So that's why you want to make sure you hit production. Like just hit production. You will not mess up the statistics that much. And if you're doing a load test, like your analytics experts will know it comes from a load test. They all came at 6 a.m. They can filter those out. Like it's being afraid of messing something up isn't an excuse for just releasing things that are going to be bugs in production for years.
So that's a great lead in. We actually have a few questions around this, how data can corrupt in production, what people are monitoring. So the first one's from Gabe. Gabe wants to know, a lot of times on production, one is constrained by live data to be able to perform and run tests. How do you circumvent this challenge with monitoring?
Can you repeat that again?
He wants to know, a lot of times on production, one of its constraints is using live data to be able to perform and run tests. How do you circumvent this challenge with monitoring?
Oh, well, sometimes. So one issue we've seen with some people, they've said like, well, we don't really have access to an API for data. So one of the best things is to use an API as your data. So it's a multi-step API test. First API gives you data, and then you run it. One issue people have is like, well, it's on a database, but there's actually a lot of different ways to turn a database into an API. We have something called Bloodhound that lets you do that. But also like there's other websites like Nordic API has a whole article about other tools as well that helps you turn databases into APIs. So that's one of the things we see all the time. Like people don't have APIs for data, but you can turn a database, like any sort of JDBC database, into those APIs for you.
Absolutely. And I see this with functional testing all the time. They usually don't take advantage of APIs. Even if they're doing UI tests, actually have an API that can get data to actually feed their functional tests. So that's a good idea. So you've seen that in production, Patrick? You see people doing that with minimal effort, actually exposing an API for data?
Yeah, it's it's pretty simple. Also, don't forget when they might be running it, they might be running it locally. So it's not as if they're releasing this database to the public. They're actually executing it from behind their firewall. So they haven't lost any security because the API that's feeding them is totally secured, and then they're hitting the production environment anyway.
Absolutely. So Patrick, we have a question from Goko. They want to know, how do you convince your management team to run tests on production? Any tricks or techniques when you're usually pitching? I know you pitch to high-level management. Does anyone give you any pushback, and how do you get them to be convinced about running tests in production?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things why we make our deck available. For some reason, management loves believing anyone but their team sometimes. So getting outside help. So that statistic about 95% of security vulnerabilities being from human error. I think that comes from Gartner. If you just Google it, but if you look at our deck, like if you start putting together like statistics from Gartner and Forrester, for whatever reason, people think those are tried and true beliefs. And then you just put together other decks like that we have presenting. The 3 examples we have in our blog about India, United States Postal Service, and I forget the third one. Those are just good use cases to present to them of like, we have a bunch of things on our blog about issues that happen that are pretty basic to test and they're not testing. And the 3 in here we talk about are just purely like things that weren't tested in production. And then also just showing them that the ROI of not testing in production can lead to these catastrophic like Equifax sort of issues. Like Equifax wasn't an API issue, but that's the sort of catastrophes that can happen.
Great. And Patrick, I know you were saying that end-to-end testing of APIs is a crucial. Do you see the reason being with microservices, people may get overconfident that they may test that microservice along the pipeline, but totally forget about when it gets to production, it's going to be interacting with all these other services?
Yeah, this is actually a common question we get when we're at the conferences. People will say, well, our developers are testing. Well, what's interesting about that is, number one, the developers will never test as well as a testing expert. We all know that just because it's not what they do. But the bigger question, the bigger pushback always to give on that is, all right, your developer built the search endpoint, has a search test, great. And then you have another developer built add to cart, has an add to cart test. Who's building that one test that connects all the pieces and creates and reproduces the user flow? Search, add to cart, checkout. Who's creating that test? That's when they don't have an answer, because no developer is going to volunteer as tribute to do all that stuff. And that's where the testing experts come in. And that's where they can really like show their position and their value. And then they extend that hopefully to monitoring as well and start taking over some of that budget. Because ultimately this comes down to the same thing. Like everyone's like tightening their budgets because of all the stuff that's going on. How do you make yourself indispensable? Well, on top of automated testing as part of a pipeline, add yourself to the functional uptime monitor. You can be the API uptime monitor champion at that company and just show the difference between what your monitor can do versus what is the existing monitors they're using, if any.
So Patrick, also another common issue I see and people usually see is not knowing what to test in an API because they don't have a clear spec on what it's supposed to do. Any tips around that?
Yeah, that one's a bit more interesting because very few APIs are very well described.
Yeah.
One thing that does help with that is making these data-driven tests with a lot of different data. Because what you're going to get is a bunch of different responses, and then you start getting a better idea as to what a smart test should be. So hitting it with every sort of type of data you can possibly imagine to see how your tests do, and then just evolve your test over time. And then sitting down with the actual like business owner of the APIs after you built these tests has also been valuable. We've actually been able to help we've done that a couple of times ourselves with like teams that couldn't set up the test, they needed help. We just went straight to the architects, sat down with them for an hour, went over our tests. They told us yes, yes, no, then moved on from there.
Great. So you did mention this is something I see as well as a lot of happy path tests with people just testing for status code 200. How do you recommend they test for the other status codes then? Because it does kind of hinge on knowing what's a bad call or what's going to generate all those other edge cases.
Yeah, well, negative testing is really interesting and useful. So if you just throw something at it that should fail, it comes back with a 401. But you can actually also, on top of that, looking for a 401, usually there's a payload with that as well. Even if the payload is just something that tells you like an error message, validate that error message is actually correct. So your test should be smart enough that whether you're giving a good data or bad data, it should say, if it's a 200, we expect this. If it's a 301, we expect this. If it's a 401, we expect this. That to us is what a good test is. It's the ability to do positive and negative testing without having to create a separate test for it. It should all be in one smart test with like if parameters or whatever it is your platform or your language chooses, but reflecting on what the response is and then analyzing it.
So when you say monitoring production, what are the KPIs? Is it just making sure the API is passing and that the response time over a certain period isn't going up?
Yeah, I mean, performance is one thing. It's a unique sort of performance. It isn't just pure speed, but the speed of like an entire transaction, a whole consumer flow. But the other thing is just comparing the functional uptime, the reliability of it. If you hit all of your functional tests every 5 minutes against production, look at what that uptime number is, and it will be lower than what the existing monitoring numbers are. And that's one of the things you bring to management. You could set up your own monitors now for a month and just look at the different numbers over the course of a week, what the uptime numbers are. You could show them like there's a 0.2% difference between what we think it is and what it actually is functionally. That alone is a huge piece of data that is invaluable to bring to management when you're making this pitch to them, saying you have the data. This isn't an argument. This isn't I feel as if it doesn't work as well. You have the data. The other part that's really interesting is we're seeing more and more customers are choosing to monitor internally. So if the whole company works off of like one pre-production environment and that thing is only up 85% of the time, that company is losing 15% of their hours per day. The whole company, everyone that works off pre-prod. So we're seeing that the vast majority of the monitoring is happening internally with they only have a couple partner APIs anyway. So they'll just monitor those as well because they have SLAs and contracts. But internally, it's just as important because if you don't have those things working on the inside, the whole thing, like your whole team has nowhere to go and nothing to do.
Great stuff. And just a reminder to the folks watching right now, if you have a question for Patrick, I forgot to mention this, all you need to do is go to the questions feature to the right of where you're seeing this video if you're in the Guild Hall. and you just get your questions in for Patrick. Just ask your question. I'll make sure to ask him live on air. Or if you want to chat among ourselves, any tips that you have that you don't necessarily want me to ask Patrick, that's what you use chat for. So make sure to get your questions in. I know there's a 30-second delay, so I may end something without knowing there's another question. So try to get your questions in as soon as possible. So Patrick, another common technique I've been seeing lately in production is feature flags. And is there anything, do you know, can you use APIs to almost act like a canary test that do a quick test segmented to that's rolled out to production, and if it fails, that you're able to roll back quickly using that?
Yeah, well, one thing, I think this is probably true for a lot of the platform choices out there, but you can actually tag tests in hours. So only running the tests that are tagged with version 2.1 or with search, like being able to run off those tags allows you to really hone in on just a subset of features that you want to test for. But I mean, again, it's one of those things where it seems really easy to us because that's what we built for. But if you're building something from scratch, that's probably a lot more difficult. But there's always ways to set it up.
Great. So thank you everyone that's asking questions. We have another question from Thomas, and Thomas wants to know, how do you map your API test to know your coverage is high? Do you check the coverage in your tool?
Yeah, so the coverage percentage is a funny thing. We're actually building a new feature around that. The way people are checking for coverages right now is mostly manual. There's a couple tools that say they do it, but it's actually very minimal. So we're working on something brand new specific to that. It is tough though. It's not easy. Like one of the important things to know with coverage is very few APIs are totally documented, which is catastrophic because at the end of the day, that means, all right, I only know about 5 of them in this like spec file, in this open API or Swagger, but actually there's 30 of them. So one of the things we tell customers to do, and something that they could do with our micro gateway Bloodhound, we could also do it with Charles, for example. It's a free tool that has a paid version, is actually, so if you're doing, let's say, mobile app testing, capturing every single API, you do all of your mobile app tests while capturing the APIs, then you analyze every single API call that was made in that mobile app throughout your testing. Then you can make sure you haven't missed anything. And that's when you start getting, again, I'm saying it's mostly manual today, and we're working on something to automate it, but there is no tool out there that perfectly automates coverage. But one of the things people should be doing more of is capturing every API transaction as they're running UI tests, whether on a mobile app or on a website. There are APIs underneath it. You should be capturing those and then making sure you have tests for each one of those.
That's a great point. I know a lot of monitoring tools like Dynatrace and things like that mention that they're able to actually capture your traffic in production, and based on that, able to create a more realistic performance test in your staging using that type of data. So is that the type of approach you can also do with strictly APIs?
Yeah, well, there's a little bit different because they're installing machines everywhere, and what they're capturing is sort of just these transaction points. When we're talking about APIs, what we're talking about is the end result. So it's the actual, like it's the sausage itself within the casing and everything. So you want to test that whole final analysis. So to do that, it's a lot more like, again, proofreading a book. It involves sort of domain knowledge and knowing what you're looking for. And again, if you just capture all of those transactions happening, you could start making sure that you're not missing anything, because we've yet to see a spec file that has everything. Spec files are really good. They're a great idea, but what we see them for is the Swagger and the open API specs. People are building them for their new APIs. But what happened to all those APIs you had built up to that point? You had a mobile app 2 years ago. So when they're coming over, they're saying, hey, we just bought MuleSoft. We're really dedicating ourselves to APIs. That's great. But then what you see is they have a spec file from that point forward, not from that point previously. And that's where capturing these API transactions becomes really invaluable.
Nice. All right, Patrick, we have a question from Tanvar. Hey, Tanvar. Tanvar's been with us forever, so thank you, Tanvar, for your question. I think he was part of the original Automation Guild in 2017. He wants to know, what are some tricks and techniques for testing security of an API? I know you did mention security, but I don't know if you gave any tips or tricks around security specifically.
Yeah, actually, that's. Let me just check something. I think we actually have a section in our docs about some common security tests to do. Yeah, so if you go to on API, I think it's apitestinguniversity.com. I think we actually have that. I think it goes to our docs, but there's a section under advanced that says functionally test the security of an API, where we go through sort of the 1, 2, 3, 4. We have like 8 different ones, 8 different sort of tests that you should keep an eye on for security testing. It's also available on apifortress.com/docs. At the bottom, we have this API testing university thing. And under advanced, there's some explainers on some of the security ones. In our platform, we actually like pre-made some security tests that you can check out as well. But the thing is, when we're talking about validating authorization schemes, for example, or validating for sensitive information, there's no real way for us to know how you do it or to create one test that applies to all. But what we have done is sort of created we told you what the concepts are, and we've created in our platform the frameworks and the beginnings of what it would look like to actually create these security tests. But some of them are just, as I was saying, like common, so logging in, just the authentication flows. Access controls is an interesting one. So if you log in as a specific user A, looking for information B, does it actually happen? This is really big today with Open API, with Open Banking. Open Banking has all this stuff where your banking information history should be available by API in Europe. What happens if you're looking for somebody else's data? Are you able to get it? That's sort of the part that's really unique over there, and that's a smart monitor you have to create. You have to make sure that the get call you're making, you know what it is, and then you compare it to what your expectations are. So is it Patrick's stuff? Yes, it's Patrick's stuff. That in itself is a security test, making sure you're not getting the wrong information. But then again, it comes down to really hitting those APIs hard with a lot of dynamic data to validate that throughout it. But again, just apifortress.com/doc. We have a university with a nice little breakdown of some of the ideas of things to test for. And one of the more interesting ones is the 3-leg OAuth. So actually like using Facebook to log into your app and then testing your app. If Facebook goes down, your app doesn't work anymore. And yet up until now, there really wasn't a way to do that. And so we just maybe 4 months ago figured out how to do that and we open sourced the code to actually be able to test that stuff. So being able to validate that initial login, because the reality is it's against their TOS. You're not supposed to automate that. But also, is it against the TOS? Like, you need to make sure your app works for your consumers. So you got to make sure that Facebook login process works. Because I don't know if you guys use mobile app, not being able to log in for a day because the Facebook login's down. Because they change stuff all the time. They don't let you know until it's already been released to the wild. So that's just one of those things. Like to us, that we think that comes into the security stuff as well, just because it's part of logging in, and the whole login process is the first step of security.
Great. So if you're in the guild hall right now, that's what I'm calling our little meetup area. I put in the chat an actual link to what Patrick's talking about. So if you click on the link, it'll take you directly to the security test section of their documentation. So is the OAuth example there as well, Patrick?
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Okay. Cool. So next question then is from, and I'm terrible with names, Mayak. They want to know, how important is CDC consumer-driven contracts, and how much does it impact in your view?
CDC, consumer-driven contracts?
There, that's what he has. They have consumer-driven content or contracts. So any ideas around consumer-driven contracts with the API?
I'm not sure what that totally means. If we're talking about contract testing, potentially. So contract testing is this interesting thing where we actually have an assertion for it in our platform, but to us, it's sort of one of the lower level methods of testing. So the thing with, so if we're talking about like contract testing, or let's say testing specifically against a spec file, Swagger, Open API, and any of the other ones you think of, their capability to define what your expectations are of an API thoroughly is very poor right now. So in our platform, you could generate a test off of a Swagger file, let's say, but that's never enough. It's just, we call it a test draft, because if you think you finalized off of that contract, you have it. And that comes down to not just sort of the responses and the response types. The big thing for us is the business logic of the API. So again, if you have a pair of shoes, the size should be 2 to 12. You don't get that sort of nuance in a contract that is absolutely necessary when you're creating a proper like API test, especially if you want to put it in a monitor and put it live, because that can keep your company from allowing yourselves to sell 30 televisions for $1 each. Like that. So we had one customer, it was a skate shop, they messed up their code in a way that allowed you to define your price as you're adding it to cart. So whatever you bought, you could say it's $1, $1, $1, and you could check out with that. That shouldn't have been possible. And so that's one of those things where they just weren't testing for. So we were building their mobile app and we found this huge catastrophe of an issue in their code and their website. So we had to tell them about it and they had to fix it quick. And then they started going back in the books and realizing that they have lost a few $1,000s of goods for $1 each because you can just set your own price. Wow. And again, what is that? That's human error. That wasn't a hacker. It's human error that they made something so obviously clear that like the JavaScript action of adding to cart was right there, right in front of you, and just change the number and like rerun it. There it is. It's just Chrome Inspector. You could change the code on the fly and then add to cart. People were adding stuff for $1. It was insane.
Well, it's a good thing for folks to look at then if they're testing or if they're hacking for sure. Cool. Is that a common thing you see, Patrick? People doing things like that obvious?
It's a common error. Most of the issues that are significant that we've found are pretty obvious. It's something you don't think of. So one of the bigger ones we saw is this company that their whole database was down for 2 hours every Monday. Like their partner API had thousands of failures every Monday for 2 hours. Long story short, what we learned was that they have an API gateway and they were caching the endpoint in the gateway, but they forgot to flush the cache every Monday when they were updating the database with these things that were out of print or they weren't building anymore. They weren't flushing the cache and they had to manually flush that cache or just set up a process. They hadn't thought of it. Like the team in charge of updating the database wasn't talking to the team in charge of like the APIs. And then the team in charge of running like the gateway thought that they were doing a performance thing. Like it's a smart idea, like these common endpoints to cache them. The issue is when the endpoint data changes, you have to flush it and restart it. This happens all the time, even with a website using Cloudflare. You got to tell Cloudflare to like undo and reset everything. Yep. Happens all the time. And again, it was a huge catastrophe for them that took them months to figure out. But the reality is it was super dumb. Like it was a small thing. But when you work for a large organization, the siloing ends up like removing your ability to be smarter through group mind. And you're just doing all these small things. It's sort of the same issue we're dealing now with, well, for me, it's working remote. I feel like I'm getting dumber working in my chair by myself as opposed to like when I was in a room with the team. Like I feel as if I'm getting worse every day. So it's just that thing you have to be careful of when you work with a large organization, especially when working remote today, is you want to leverage everyone's expertise in a way and make sure you communicate throughout the organization and not just push something to monitoring and assume they'll take care of it.
So that's interesting. Monitoring and dashboarding becomes even more important now in this COVID-19 type situation, for sure, probably.
Yeah, well, that's one of the bigger items that we when we talk to customers, the big issue they come to us with is many companies set up a group. So this group of 4 developers, 1 tester, another group of 4 developers, 1 tester. And those 2 testers are using totally different things and not communicating. So that's one of the things so our unique thing is that, we have a downloadable application, but ultimately we're a cloud platform that unifies and standardizes that process. So that's the thing we're always pushing upon people. Like, even if you're not going to use API Fortress, like you need to make sure everyone's on the same page, because what happens if you have someone that's like a SOAP UI expert, leaves the company, you replace them with someone that has never used SOAP UI before, all of those tests up to that point may become completely useless. They may have to just rewrite everything. So you want to make sure you have one standardized process in which everyone can agree to and they could take over. If one person goes on vacation, you want to know how to take over their tests. But if they're trying to write these tests in JavaScript and Postman and they're a SOAP UI expert writing Groovy, those are 2 different things. They don't know how they can't just sit in that seat and make it work. So that's something that we really push on. Like when you're ready to take this stuff seriously, just solidify, make sure everyone's using the same system, whether it's an open source system you're using or whether it's, you purchase a platform.
So the API caching issue you talked about, the database on the back end, would that have been caught if someone was running in production with monitoring? Would it be like an uptime check, just pinging it, make sure it's up?
Well, that's how we caught it. So we actually caught it. They hadn't caught it for months until they brought us in. So what we did is they had one endpoint, they gave you every single product. Then they had another endpoint that lets you dive into each product individually, similar to that example I showed before. So what we found is when you actually jump into hundreds of the product IDs, you jump into hundreds of them, you will find, because they didn't cache the product detail page endpoint, they were just caching the listing endpoint. So when you dove into hundreds of those product IDs individually, you see a bunch of them wouldn't work. And so that's when you start realizing that, well, how is that possible? Like, this is supposed to be all the products that are available, yet hundreds aren't working right now. Then you sort of back into figuring out, like, oh, these are cached and these are old. These are no longer applicable as of this week, but they were fine as of Sunday night.
Great, great. All right, Patrick, we have a question for Prasad. He wants to know about WebSocket APIs. What is the best tool to test WebSocket APIs, or does API Fortress support WebSocket APIs?
No, we're not. We don't do WebSocket APIs, and I don't know enough about it to make suggestions. You know what's interesting though with API testing? Like, we've actually had people come in and ask us, well, how do you test the API of oil? So like, API is a fairly common acronym, and it's used for a lot of stuff. So we've had oil, we've had eyeglasses. There's a term API testing is something for eyeglasses. And then the third one we've seen is, and this is actually sort of the back in the day. So when you're creating, like, creating Windows app and you want to use the mouse, they were using APIs, like, to interact hardware with, like, the Windows operating system. What we talk about, and where our expertise is specifically, is HTTP-based APIs. So REST, SOAP, GraphQL. That's sort of our wheelhouse. Anything outside of that, if I say anything, I'm just going to be BSing, saying lies.
So GraphQL seems to be gaining popularity. Any reason why?
It's just a fun topic. In terms of the conversations, very common. In terms of people that are actually actively using it massively, very minor. I think it's one of those things that people realize it's robust and it's powerful and it's interesting. But again, we deal with enterprises. They just recently got off of SOAP to REST.
Wow.
They just moved on to REST. So they're not ready for the GraphQL conversation. So we have stuff on it and we show people how to do it. Because at the end of the day, it is just an API call. It's not super complicated. But in terms of, like, what we're seeing in production, we don't run into many companies that are actively using it, besides, maybe startups, like companies that have just started building their platform the last, like, 3 years.
Yep.
They can be using it, but legacy, banks and stuff, not even close.
So William has a question. He wants to know, based on your experience, like I say, you talk to a lot of different companies, you see a lot of use cases, financial institutions versus telecom operations, who tests their APIs more? For what reasons? Based on the engagements that you've had, because I have to approach both of them soon. So I don't know if you have any insight into either one of those particular verticals.
What I've noticed is that banks spend a lot of time in testing before it goes live, and a lot of it's very manual. Like, they'll have hundreds of SOAP UI tests and they'll just try to run that. But then once it's live, they've sort of lost track of everything. With telecoms, I'm finding they're better at monitoring. So, like, testing in production, they're a little bit better at that. But the actual testing before they push something live, they're weaker at that. So banking, I find to be very poor at monitoring, while telecoms I find to be not super great at testing before they push it live. But then their monitoring is usually a little bit smarter than you would expect. It's not as good as it should be, but it's not bad, because telecoms, it's a lot of high-speed communications. The same thing we've seen with communications companies and media companies. They really take monitoring seriously, but the actual functional tests as part of their CI pipeline were weaker than expected.
Great. So Patrick, you said you didn't want to use this as a promo for API Fortress, but I'm just curious, is there any API Fortress functionality that automates a lot of this stuff for you automatically? So it takes a lot of the manual work out of what you've seen people doing with other kind of Frankenstein solutions, pasting and cutting, creating,
Yeah, for us, the very first thing we show is just generate tests. So if you have a spec file or just a payload, you just load up a payload, push a button. We give you a framework of that test. But again, we call it a draft. But the reality is, like, I don't know if you've ever seen such as the Instagram API. It's so tall, it's so nested, and writing that by hand is a mess. Why not just get the framework of the things set up for you automatically, and then you could start adding intelligence to it. So that saves you a lot of time. So you're not spending much time on the dumb stuff. You're spending time on the smart stuff. And so that's the thing for us, is we give you this sort of workbench. All right, here's this endpoint's, like, functional test. Oh, here's another functional test. Oh, do you want to connect these and start creating a flow? We try to expedite the process of laying that out so that you can actually spend more time on your expertise and making it smart. Because if you're spending your entire day on just setting up the basics, you've wasted a lot of your time. And then the other item for us that we have a built-in scheduler because we're cloud-based. We're not a local application. Like how do you schedule something in Excel? That's not how things work. So our initial start is in the cloud aspect. So whether it's on our cloud or whether we give you the container and you deploy it, we have a scheduler built in. So that means you can run it as part of your CI pipelines using APIs, and then you can schedule it. So you're using the exact same tests for both processes. And that's the reason why we had these conversations, because we've realized like we've built this stuff and our customers have really showed us how they're using it. And that's why I'm trying to spread the gospel of what they've been doing in these successful companies where they have their testing team take over the API monitoring because they're using all these functional tests and they're pushing a button to just schedule this test, run this test against production. If you have a platform that sets that up for you and it's set up correctly, you can save yourself a lot of time and do a lot of work using just a couple people. It's supposed to just, a lot of the customers we deal with at large organizations, they have to defer a lot of the stuff to SIs like overseas, and they don't have much ability to see what they're doing. They just get a report that says, yeah, everything tested fine. They need more information than that. So like a unified dashboard is where you get that power.
Awesome. So Patrick, Sergio asked a question about third-party APIs. A lot of times you get charged for them, especially if you're running a production. Any tips on what you see people do when they have to test third-party APIs in staging or even in production?
Mocking. That is where it comes down to mocking. There's a lot of open source frameworks out there. We actually have mocking in our platform as well. But it really comes down to just setting up mocks and then leveraging those mocks. What's interesting too is with our platform, you can actually record a bunch of API calls, the transactions using Bloodhound. Again, it's open source. That's why I talk about Bloodhound. It's free, so it applies to everyone. It's on GitHub Bloodhound. But it can capture all of these API calls, and then you could push a button in our platform and then push a button and turn them into mocks. But again, it's capturing all these API calls, and with Bloodhound, you could also set them to like a logging thing, like Elastic or Kibana or whatever, Elastic. And then from there, you can create mocks using open source kits as well, or in ours. It's whichever one you choose. But mocking is really the key. And mocking is sort of the key of that whole shift left thing. Like mock the APIs before they're live, so you can start writing the tests before they're even live. Same thing you could do with generating a test off a Swagger file. You generate that test, you start adding intelligence to it, but you can't run it until you either have a mock ready to go or the APIs are ready to go.
So Patrick, any challenges now as people move towards more cloud-based SaaS solutions and also Kubernetes and Docker? Does that impact anything with APIs that people need to think about differently that they may not have back in the day?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing we see today, day to day, is the difference between a public API and a private API. People sometimes create an account in our platform in the cloud version, and then they ask, well, this works in Postman, but it doesn't work on API Fortress Cloud. Well, it's because what you're trying to hit is an API that's only available through your VPN on your laptop, or you built that API on your local machine. So that's one thing you need to realize. There's a huge difference between all right, well, I pushed this button and I ran the test locally. Now I guess I should just schedule this. Is it available from where you're scheduling it? Because if you're just going to use an APIfortress.com or Postman's monitors, that's running from outside your organization, and they probably don't have access to those APIs. And will your security team white label those APIs? It's a long path, which is why one of the bigger things we've done is we've sort of containerized the whole thing. So the whole platform's a container, and we give it to you, and then you could deploy it internally in your organization, so it has access to all the APIs. And it's totally secured, and you can schedule and everything, and nothing goes back to any sort of cloud. You have complete ownership of the data and the security, and it's one of those funny things that people don't consider until they start playing with it and start looking at different tools, and they start realizing that we can do this, and they're like, oh, I noticed I can't do this with some of the other tools. Yeah, we have this unique advantage because we didn't start as an application that's trying to become cloud. We were cloud becoming more and more a local application that connects to this cloud, whether it's your on-prem version or the cloud one. It's always be mindful of if the API is hittable from some third party's AWS in Virginia. Because if it's not, you need to reconsider how you're going to be handling monitoring production, how you're going to be handling monitoring. Obviously, if it's in production, it's fine, but most APIs, like an iceberg, are below or behind that firewall. And you want to be monitoring those as well. Like our most active customers are the ones doing a bunch of internal monitoring. So how do you do that internally? Because you can't always defer to a third-party cloud because they won't have access.
Awesome stuff, Patrick. Those are all the questions we have. We're actually almost out of time here at the Guild. Before we go, Patrick, any parting words of wisdom you want to leave the Guild around API testing, monitoring, anything around those lines?
Sure. So it's a bit of a weird thing, but basically, like I do with testing teams every day, they're constantly having their budgets cut, but then no one actually ever talks about cutting monitoring because it's so important. But the reality is they're not doing API monitoring well. Take that budget back. Like just, you can do it better than them. And it's not about starting a war. It's about filling a gap. And so when people start talking about like, where can we save money? Well, they shouldn't be saving money on testing. And the way to reinforce that is say, well, we're also monitoring. We're also making sure these things are up and running for the consumers. So you sort of double emphasize like the importance of your team. Because unfortunately, like we've been seeing in the last 6 months, the first place people make cuts is the testing team, which is insane to us. Yep. Like it's just unbelievable. You want to make that cut there. So reinforcing like we're actually keeping you from having security vulnerabilities because we're making sure human errors don't go live and then making sure they're not already live. Like that's how you sort of double reinforce your value to the organization and start fighting for your budgets back, because it's rough out there where people just don't understand where they should be making cuts, and they're making cuts at some of the worst places.
Well, it's kind of grim as a last parting word of wisdom, but thank you, Patrick, for that.
I mean, it's the opposite of grim. I'm trying to like reinforce you. Like,
okay,
fight back. The monitoring team isn't doing a good job. Go across the hall and go fight the monitoring team. You can do better.
Awesome. Thanks again, Patrick. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
All right, have a good one. Thanks.
Talk to you later. Cheers. All right, so that was Patrick. Like I said, really great session here. So I just want to thank everyone for participating and for asking questions. So thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Gaku. Thank you, Raj. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tanva. Thank you, Mayak. Thank you, Prasad. Thank you, William. Also, thank you, everyone, for the comments. So thank you, Rebecca, D, Martin, Raj, Rajet has some really good comments around GraphQL. So thank you, everyone. Like I said, anyone that joins a test guild, they're usually a testing expert themselves. So I love people sharing their knowledge as well within the chat. It's not just about me. It's not just about the speaker. It's the guild. That's why I called it Testing Guild, because it's all of us coming together to share a tip, tool, technique, or best practice to help us with our day-to-day testing awesomeness. So thank you, everyone. This was an awesome session. Really appreciate you all. So if you have any questions, concerns, or you want to have a topic presented or a speaker that we don't have, just drop me a note at joe@testguild.com. Next week, we're going to have a session on how to check your tests without running them with Quoding. So he has this cool free lint tool. So almost as you're programming in your IDE, it will tell you, hey, this is a Selenium bad practice, or I think it works with Puppeteer now. It'll give you options as you're coding in your IntelliSense to say, here's a better option, or we'll scan it. But if you actually, before you push it to production, to say, this could be a potential issue, you may want to look at this. So really cool tool, free tool. You definitely want to check that out. So that would be Quoding. Quo's awesome as well. He'll be joining us next week, but he'll be joining us at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So it'll be a later session for folks that join us that usually don't join us now from the UK or India. I try to do both earlier and later, so to cover both time zones. So thank you, everyone, for joining us early today. Thanks again, Rebecca. Really appreciate you. And as I said, any questions that you have for me, or you want to have some topic or speakers join us for our upcoming test guilds, just send me an email at joe@testguild.com. Thank you all, and appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.